Good evening, everyone, and a very warm welcome to today's session. We thank you for joining us for the book launch of Education and Inequality, Historical and Contemporary Trajectories, edited by Vikas Gupta, Ramakant Agnihotri, and Minati Panda. The book launch will be followed by a discussion with panelists Dennis Layton, Deepak Kumar, Amita Dhanda, Aisha Kidwai, and D. Narasimha Reddy, in conversation with Prabhu Mohapatra, the moderator of the session. Education and Inequality is a contributory volume that discusses the historical context of modernity and inequality and its reciprocal relationship with education, while stressing on the need to understand the evolution of social inequalities through time and how they continue to play a major role in determining the level and quality of education that one gets in India. I will now introduce the volume editors. Dr. Vikas Gupta. Dr. Vikas Gupta is Associate Professor at the Department of History, University of Delhi. His areas of academic research include historical and contemporary aspects of education in modern India, with special focus on curricular knowledge, social inequalities, state policies, and school practices. Besides publishing numerous journal articles and book chapters, he has delivered lectures at a large number of national and international conferences and has been the recipient of grants and fellowships from the Max Weber Foundation, German Historical Institute, Charles Wallace Trust for India, and the ICHR. He is the organizing secretary of the All India Forum for Right to Education and Board of Trustee Kishore Bharati. Professor Ramakant Agnihotri, retired as Professor and Head, Department of Linguistics, University of Delhi. He is interested in and has taught and written extensively about applied linguistics, morphology, sociolinguistics, and research methods for several years. He was the chairperson of the NCERT National Focus Group on the Teaching of Indian Languages and is at present Professor Emeritus at Vidya Bhavan Society, Udaipur. Professor Minati Panda teaches cultural psychology and education at the Zakir Hussain Center for Educational Studies and is director of the National Multilingual Educational Resource Consortium at JNU. She has published widely on issues related to school education, and her areas of interest include curriculum and pedagogy, and multilingual education and child right discourse. The volume will be launched by Professor Prabhu Mohapatra, Professor of Economic History at Delhi University. He has taught courses in Economic History of Modern India, National Movement and Strategies of Imperial Control, and has contributed to education history by supervising doctoral and postgraduate research on the subject. He will also be moderating the panel discussion. I now request Professor Mohapatra to kindly do the honors.
Good evening, and it's my great pleasure and privilege to be part of this panel, and also to be part of I think a historically groundbreaking event, which is launching of this book. But before I say anything about this book, let me first release the book from its confines. It is here for all of you to see. This is Education and Inequality, Historical and Contemporary Trajectories. The book has multiple, it's a brilliant book, brilliantly got together, got up by excellent editing and excellent production value. And I must say that the book, as you could have made out from the fact that this is edited by a historian, an eminent linguist, and a cultural psychology professor. Now, this combination of editors in some ways represent the character of the book project itself, which is essentially at its heart deeply multidisciplinary. And not just multidisciplinary, it's deeply multivocal, as one of the authors in this book says. It is written from multiple styles, some academic, some non-academic, and coming from different and employing different methodological perspectives. These usually would have been a sign of a certain type of chaos. But on the other hand, the book is united by the laser-like focus the book has on the question of interplay between the discourses of education, discourses and practices of education on the one hand, and the entrenched social inequalities in India and the worldwide. And to locate this interplay between education and inequality, the question of inequality and education, here the idea is not as if education is outside and inequality is something which is, there's two separate entities. You can make out that the inequalities that have been traced here are partly produced by the practice of education, the discourse of education itself. And that's what makes this book so important, so timely. Consisting of 25 essays and divided into 5 coherent parts, each interconnected. The first being the encounter of modernity and colonialism in the domain of education, which lays the groundwork for both emergence of educational discourses as well as of the question of social inequality in the modern period, at least from the colonial period. The second is the colonization and decolonization and the domain of knowledge. The third part comes to the challenge of language and language of education, the challenge of language and inequalities of education. And then the fourth part is about social exclusion. And the final part is about the impact of neoliberalism on educational inequality. As you can make out, this architecture of the book draws strongly from not only the concerns of each of the authors, and we'll hear a lot from our panelists about it. Some of the authors are actual academics and scholars, others are activists, but most of them are scholar activists. That means they are united by not only their academic expertise or in different fields, but all focused around questions of education and inequality. But more importantly, they have all contributors and editors are focused on making our society better, making it better, less equal, less unequal, and to free it from what Professor Sabyasachi Bhattacharya had once called from the dual disease of the scourge of convergence of privilege on one side, of caste, class, and gender privileges, and the convergence of inequalities and disprivilege or underprivileged on the other, of caste. So this particular congruence, which is the bane of our society and which has persisted, is the main focus of, and that unites these authors. Education and Inequality, Historical and Contemporary Trajectories focuses on the ways in which, despite claims of expansion and improvement, education in India continues to be marked by overwhelming levels of inequalities and exclusions in access, participation, completion, and outcomes. The stark figure of that even after 73 years of independence, about 85% children in the relevant age groups are unable to complete full-time formal schooling. Now, this is, I think, an eye-opening statistics and so persistent. This percentage is even higher amongst the case of historically marginalized groups and communities. The essays in this volume use the perspectives of class, caste, and gender and disability, and the lenses of culture and religion to understand the overall normative pattern of education in the way it tends to exclude the majority of our population, its concerns, languages, and knowledge. The volume also traces the historical trajectories of modernity and inequality and their reciprocal relationship with education. It expresses serious concern about the increased withdrawal of state from education and the growing disintegration of structures of public education in our times. The contributors to the volume are experts with diverse interdisciplinary concerns. I now would like to introduce our expert, the panelists, who we are privileged. I am privileged to be part of and to be moderating their discussions. They would discuss different aspects of the book from their own angles, and I would like to just quickly go through their different. It's not in the order. It's in the order of what I would expect they would present. Professor Dennis Layton is Professor and Dean in the Jindal School of Languages and Literature of OP Jindal Global University. He has worked in several areas of history, European studies and global studies since 1990, and has worked in Delhi University and Ambedkar University and several US colleges and universities. He holds degrees from University of Virginia, Washington University, St. Louis, and has studied at Freiburg and was in Mansfield College, University of Oxford. He's been recipient of several fellowships and research grants, and his major monographic publications include The Greenian Moment and Lives of Victorian Political Figures. For more than, and the second our panelist is Professor Deepak Kumar, eminent scientist of, historian of science. For more than 40 years, Deepak Kumar has researched, published, and taught on issues related to science and society in context of colonial India. He is the former professor of education at JNU and known for his book Science and the Raj and the Trishanku Nation. In addition, he has edited books on history of education, technology, medicine, and environment. Currently, he's writing a book in Hindi on culture and society. Ayesha Kidwai is professor at Center for Linguistics at JNU, as well as a translator and women's rights activist. Her research interests range from theoretical morphosyntax and semantics to field linguistics, acquisition studies, and politics of language in society and policy. Subjects that she has widely published and lectured on at universities in India and abroad. And she has served as senior editor, Oxford Research Encyclopedia in Linguistics. In 2013, she was honored with the Infosys Prize in Humanities on Theoretical Linguistics. Amita Dhanda is Professor of Emerita at Nalsar University of Law, Hyderabad. She has been engaging with questions of equality and inclusion in her research and writings. Professor Narasimha Reddy was formerly Professor of Economics at University of Hyderabad. At present, he is the Honorary Visiting Professor at Institute for Human Development, New Delhi. His areas of specialization include labor economics, agrarian studies, and political economy of development. His publications include rural labor mobility in times of structural transformation, dynamics and perspectives from Asian economies, and India, Social Development Report 2018, Rising Inequalities in India. That is in 2019, published in 2019. I am greatly pleased to invite my esteemed colleagues to reflect on the book, on everything they find interesting about the book, or they found lacunas in the book equally. And I would ask my colleague, Professor Dennis Layton, to begin. And he would speak for about 15 minutes. And we would have, thank you, Dennis, for agreeing to be here. And I'd like you to speak.
Thank you, Prabhu, and thank you, everyone. Thank you to the editorial team, the people who were involved in the production of this fine book, for inviting me to be part of this book launch. I may or may not spend as much as 15 minutes. My original brief, at least, was to really focus on part one of the book. Professor Mohapatra had told something about different sections of the book and how they fit together. So I'll be commenting mainly about the 5 parts or chapters that are part of the section called Encounter with Modernity and Colonialism in the Domain of Education. You've seen those of you in the audience have seen both the title page and the contents page there. Probably haven't burnt it into your memory, but the overview or introductory chapter of the book is very fine, comprehensive, and sensitive overview of some issues concerning education in India in relation to colonial modernity. And I was pleased to see that Vikas Gupta had managed to cover a lot of ground in terms of referring to leading thinkers, some of whom are, most of whom are quite well known, and without going overboard or getting overly theoretical in trying to kind of unpack theoretical underpinnings that the various contributors to this volume kind of used in their own work, was very straightforward and historical, and even historical as an overview of older and more recent literature on the subject of education in India, particularly over the past two centuries. And I must take the opportunity to compliment Orient Black Swan for deciding to publish something like this, because it's in some ways a very nice complement and an addition to a book that an earlier avatar of Orient published about 25 years ago. I'm referring to the book edited by Sabyasachi Bhattacharya called The Contested Terrain, which was published by Orient Longman in 1998. And Dr. Gupta also makes reference to another important book from around the same era, edited by Nigel Crook as part of a School of Oriental and African Studies publication system called The Transmission of Knowledge in South Asia. And it's interesting looking at these book chapters to see in what ways we've gone beyond both of those books. And I would again compliment Orient Black Swan for deciding that this is the kind of book that is worth publishing. As I said, it's a nice complement and in many ways an addition to some very important interventions that were made about 25 years ago in the way of general overviews of history of Indian education and so on. In terms of these 5 contributions, in terms of contributing to understanding of the encounter with modernity and colonialism, one of the terms of art, of course, these days is not just modernity, but colonial modernity, and the particular ways in which India experienced and both contributed to colonial modernity, not merely as a passive, recipient of structures and ideas and programs and policies imposed by the West, but also as as being an agent of its own reproduction. And I think this is something that is touched upon in several of these contributions. If I have one word for Dr. Gupta, and I'm going to make a reference here that crops up in some of the other contributions. An interesting, fairly recent book by Londa Shemiger and Robert Proctor called Agnotology, literally the science of ignorance, and how ignorance and lack of knowledge or absence of knowledge is produced and reproduced in ways that are quite interesting and need to be considered alongside studying knowledge and knowledge systems and so on. Being an educationist, I'm actually kind of cynical about what any organized education system can provide or do anywhere in the world. And for some reason, I've always taken comfort in a statement made by a great mathematician and historian of science named Otto Neugebauer, who said somewhere that no system of education known to man is capable of ruining everyone, or maybe anybody is the word to use. No system of education known to man is capable of ruining everybody. And he said that rather ironically with reference even to his own educational experience and so on. And I think those are kind of, maybe a cliche, but kind of wise words in trying to get a grip on colonial modernity and how education and the construction of education systems contributed to colonial modernity. Some of that is, I think, at least alluded to in Dr. Gupta's chapter, and I'm not going to give equal time to all of these chapters, but just a few high points or observations about each of them. The next chapter by Andreas Gestrich, which focuses on disruptions of modernity as they were experienced in Western countries, not only Germany, but in France and Britain and even the United States and so on. The developed West, quite interesting quite interesting survey of the the problems of establishing education systems in general. And I think we do well to keep in mind that education system, no matter how much Plato or Aristotle or Thomas Aquinas or Descartes or Francis Bacon or not to mention countless Indian thinkers over the ages, we have to remember that education systems are very modern inventions. Education is not, I would say, actually a thing to be obtained or achieved, though modernity and neoliberalism in particular discursively frame education as if it were that, something that can be systemized and quantified and delivered according to certain specifications. Of course, in a loose sort of way, we can talk about an education system in any society at any time in the past and in the present, but the whole idea of an education system is really a product of modernity, whether colonial modernity or Western modernity. And it's really in part because of the more recent market-driven, or for that matter, state-driven experiments in constructing education systems that we actually can come to grips with what education means or what it is made to mean. And again, I don't want to sound like I'm plugging someone else's book, but that text I mentioned by Schiebinger and Proctor, Agnotology, I think is actually quite interesting about how not only knowledge and knowing are produced, but not knowing and evasion of knowing are, of course, notorious products of education systems also. And it was exactly that I think Otto Neugebauer was referring to when he said that no system of education is capable of ruining everybody. So anyway, Professor Gestrich's chapter was very comprehensive in that way. And I remember when he delivered the paper as part of the conference which produced this book. Anil Sadgopal's presentation or attempt to describe or even summarize the reconfiguration of existing social hierarchies in India as part of colonialism is also quite interesting. Unfortunately, I'm running out of time and I don't want to attempt to summarize that, but of course the point has been made before, but deserves to be made, I think, quite regularly, right? That there were social hierarchies that certainly existed. We often talk rather loosely about the new social hierarchies that were established by colonialism in India, but of course, social hierarchies are always there in all societies we know of, and education, whether primary education or higher education, was a field in which these social hierarchies were reconfigured and reconstructed and made useful for the colonial state. Another chapter by Janaki Rajan about the school teacher of India is a very pleasing and straightforward title, but again gives a lot of both interesting details as well as useful generalizations about how the school teacher was made and continues to be made in India. Of course, we know that there were all kinds of pundits and masters and gurus and so on, and practical as well as theoretical teachers all throughout Indian history. But I like the elegant simplicity of the title, The School Teacher in India, which actually, the chapter itself carries a lot of interesting details about how, among other things, school teaching was professionalized or put in a rather different professional framework in the 19th and 20th centuries. Finally, just to say a few words about Umesh Bagade's exploration of Jyotirao Phule and his contributions to debates about education and about inclusion and exclusion. Vikas Gupta himself, in the introduction, refers to the discursive rupture that Jyotirao Phule, you can't say that he actually created it, nor was it even a very lasting discursive rupture. Nevertheless, it was a kind of discursive intervention, which was very important in terms of the whole self-understanding of late colonial Indian nationalism, particularly in the 1880s and 1890s, when there were a lot of friends of primary education in India, both people directly inspired by Western authorities, as well as those who creatively appropriated some Western ideas about the application and the extension of education. It's a very interesting chapter by Umesh Bagade about this discursive rupture that Jyotirao Phule contributed to. I will just finish up here by saying that although neoliberalism is one of the bad things that several contributors to this volume constantly refer to, I think correctly, and in other cases not so correctly, attributing certain ills and problems to neoliberalism. It's difficult to refute that, except one should consider that some of the illusions about what we call liberal education today were used just as effectively by autocracies, say the Austro-Hungarian Empire, which produced my friend Otto Neugebauer, as well as the Russian Empire and several other autocratic states, also valorized liberal education in particular ways and positioned liberal education in relation to what was merely vocational or practical education. And this, again, is part of a general phenomenon of modernity. These are very interesting contributions trying to kind of flesh out how the colonial context made this particular game play out. So I think I will leave it at that. Again, I'm appreciative of Orient Black Swan for agreeing to publish this. And although it's quite a doorstopper at some 795 pages or something, the contributions are very valuable, all 25 of them, as Prabhu just mentioned. And they're well worth reading and studying by people interested in education in India and in other places. That's all I have to say for now. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Then Professor Deepak Kumar, thank you, Dennis. And I would like Professor Deepak Kumar to follow up and make his comments, valuable comments.
Thank you very much. I hope I'm audible. Is it okay? Thank you. Well, I enjoyed browsing through the volume. I congratulate the editors, the contributors. It's on a very significant theme, and the papers are very well drafted. The citations comprehensive, and of course, education, as we all understand, we know, is a subject which requires different disciplinary or subdisciplinary focus. This volume is going to contribute immensely to our understanding, as well as to future researchers who want to pick up and move forward. I understand that both part 1 and part 2 have a great deal in common. And I'm glad that most of the way it has been divided, they are not like watertight compartments. There is fluidity, there is a relationship with each other. So, for example, I thoroughly enjoyed reading Professor Anil Sadgopal's view, and when he goes back to the colonial vision of education, and of course the anti-caste educational discourse, which is picked up also by Dr. Umesh when he discusses Mahatma Phule and his views on education, so forth. Part two, for which I have been asked to give certain comments, has very interesting 5 essays, which begins with Professor Amar Faruqi's essay on mid-19th century, centered mostly on Delhi. This has been this period has been extremely significant, follows the so-called Bengal Renaissance of the 1830s, 40s. And in Delhi, especially before and after the Great Revolt, you find the city in some kind in some kind of a intellectual torpor at the same time, and there were great names. Ghalib himself, Master Ramchandra, mathematics teacher, Nazir Ahmed Saab, great novelist, and Professor Faruqi's essay, is encompasses without any fuss and jargon, very lucidly, the spirit of the time, the spirit of the age. I wish he had talked a little bit on the interaction between between some of the intellectual giants like Munshi Jakaullah with Ghalib himself. Ghalib was offered a job in Zakir Hussain College, which today is known as Zakir Hussain College, then Delhi College, and which of course he couldn't continue with. He didn't even join probably. He was a class apart. So, but his views on modernity need to be recalled. I'm just reminded of at that time Syed Ahmad, who was in government service, had prepared in around 1855 an anthology with his own introduction of Ain-e-Akbari, Abul Fazl's Ain-e-Akbari. And he wanted Ghalib to write a foreword. Ghalib looked at it and admonished Syed Ahmad, saying, "What are you doing? What is the use of going back to Abul Fazl when you can see in Calcutta that the British are harnessing steam power, telegraph? They can send, their own voice through wire with the help of a wire." So all kinds of. Then he says, please don't go back to distant past. Look into the future, prepare for the future, and he refused to write a foreword. Later, we all know Syed Ahmad turned into a great modernist himself, and in terms of education, made great contributions. However, I was wondering if, talking about Master Ramchandra, Nazir Ahmed, Zakaullah, and many others, whether one can also talk about some kind of a Delhi Renaissance. Professor Faruqi stopped short of it. And I'm glad, because he allows the reader to make his own inferences. He doesn't impose. And he doesn't impose, which you find in terms of Calcutta intellectual history, that there are very strong opinion about this. Yes, there was a Bengal Renaissance. And there were others who felt, no, the class could not have ushered Renaissance. But anyway, that's another story. Arun Kumar's article on crime, labor, and school curriculum was something very new to me. I have learned from him, I must admit, I have learned from it, especially his description of the reformatory schools in Chunar and Chingalpat. And, the curriculum, the way it was drafted, for example, I was absolutely fascinated by references to texts or titles like Pakiza Khayalat, Sadvichar, and kind of things. So, I think it was some kind of a indigenous response or indigenous articulation of Victorian morality or Christian morality. I don't know, but the curriculum is very interesting, and that too, in terms of a reformatory school. They were also taught books like agriculture primer, sanitary primer, and so forth. Maybe those students were being prepared, who were considered to have criminal antecedents, they were being prepared for work later once they come out of that reformatory school. So very, very fascinating chapter this one is, and I think this should find place in our teaching of history of education. Similarly, there are three such articles which so far we have, as historians of education, have ignored. One, of course, is these reformatory schools I was not aware of. Second is very interesting on the physical education. The Vyayam Mandirs were established in many parts of the country, in Pune, in Baroda, Amravati, Kolkata, many places. So, so how people thought about the physical education, their appearance, their physique, because the colonizers had hammered the point that this was an effeminate race. An effeminate race had to appear strong. Vivekananda is known to have said that if you want to drive the British out, play football, have high protein diet, and so forth. So, this chapter on physical education seems, I understand one of my students has done thesis also in physical education at my center. So far as I know, I haven't seen it, but physical education is part of an area of education which we need to know a little more about, and this paper helps by Dr. Narmata. Thank you, Namrata. A very fascinating piece, which of course, we have read Professor Lakshmi Subramanian's book on music. It's something which she leaves the trodden road, and here this aspect of music learning which she picks up, Gurukul Parampara, Guru Shishya Parampara, is absolutely fascinating. And we all know, we have learned from her book itself, her command over history of music, Professor Subramanian's command over history of music, and the Madras, the role played by Madras Musical Society, and the learned Vidwans who lived there. And her paper mostly focuses on the Carnatic style of music. But, we could have benefited little more had she given a paragraph comparing it with what was happening in Agra, in Gwalior, in Patiala, where we had another kind of gharana going on, and all this under Guru Shishya Parampara. In fact, the Tawayafs of, the so-called Tawayafs of Banaras, Allahabad, Patna, they have also played a great role in enriching, not only preserving, but in enriching our musical tradition. I hope that this paper would lead to more work by scholars interested in Hindustani music also, and bring out, the facets of Guru Shishya Parampara, and which we have lost. You don't find musical history in our archives, in our archival records. Other aspects of education, other aspects will be reflected in our archival document. But I have spent a good deal of time at National Archive and I didn't come across. So therefore, Professor Subramaniam's article should stimulate our younger scholars to look for its ramifications in other parts of the country. She has also talked about, in that the last part of her essay, on how this online education has come. So what will happen to Guru Shishya Parampara? I'm talking to you through a medium where, we lack human touch. Can music be done without human touch? I doubt. I personally feel even teaching cannot be done without human touch. But somehow we have been forced to a situation like this when most of us, for last couple of months and even earlier also, the things had gone online. People were, what you call, Google has emerged as a Sarva Shaktiman knowledge, omniscient and omnipresent thing. So libraries are losing their significance. Library as an instrument of knowledge, library as a center of education, library as a teaching place. So online, what will happen? Anyway, I have only a couple, 2-4 minutes more. So I move to the last chapter by Professor Singh. The title is pretty, personally, I'm not comfortable with the title, but it talks about Eurocentrism, Brahmanical hegemony, and colonial science education. So, बहुत सारी बातें इसमें, lots of things are being said here on Eurocentrism, Brahmanical hegemony, but in this melee, unfortunately, science is missing. Science takes a backseat. So I thought in this chapter we would find little more on science, but that takes a backseat. However, he raises some important questions. He says that during 1920s, Calcutta was the site of very important discoveries. You have Satyendra Bose, you have Meghnad Saha, you have P.C. Ray. I'm also asked several times as a student of history of science, how is it that colonial India produced so many illustrious scientists? It's like a constellation appears in the first quarter of the 20th century, which we don't see later. Why? How is it that colonial India produced such magnificent and post-colonial, post-independent India doesn't have? Well, I don't have a clear-cut answer, but I thought that, I expected Professor Singh to dilate upon this, to discuss this a little more. He talks about Sir Syed Ahmad, he talks about Mahendralal Sarkar, P.C. Ray, C.V. Raman, others, but, very, very briefly. And I wish he had concentrated more on science part, but he does make a very valid point, important point, that countering Eurocentrism with another parochial narrative, which is mostly Brahmanical, may not be proper. It's not proper. So when we talk in terms of indigenous knowledge system, a traditional knowledge system, etc., we are trying to posit it to the Eurocentric view. I think that is equally wrong, and I agree with him. There are some, I would consider it sweeping generalization, like on page 304, the author, Professor Singh, says that, Ananda Math sowed the seeds of communal divide, which the British fully exploited, and so forth. I would not like to give the great Bankim Chand that much credit to have, Vande Mataram has its own history, which my teacher Sabyasachi Bhattacharya has done. It was written at a particular context in a particular specific period of time. So many things happen because of several other reasons also. And we shouldn't put, so this could have been avoided. And but I would say that I did miss focus on science education. Taken together, these chapters make very valuable contribution. As I said, I was absolutely struck by the originality of the three papers on labor, the reformatory schools, on
Music.
yes, physical education and music, Guru Shishya Parampara. So, and other parts of the volume also have gone through, and that I hope then some listeners would inquire about after once this panel presentation is over. The volume, I must comment, is a very, very though ambitious but successful exercise. It's a huge volume, ambitious but very successful, and I congratulate again the editors and the publisher. And it has come out so well in a paperback edition. So I'll strongly commend it. Thank you very much for the opportunity to benefit from this volume's essays. Thanks again.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Professor Deepak Kumar. It is wonderful listening to you. And I would like Ayesha now to take the torch and show us some more light. Wow.
Hello, everybody. I think I'm going to do, first of all, I'd like to thank the editors for inviting me. And I think I'm going to do it rather than go through article by article. Would like to talk generally about how this volume echoes, influences my own thinking on the way that we have to be as linguists in India and in other countries which are part of multilingual societies where monolingualism is not the ruling practice. It might be the ideology of even many of the states that we live in, but it is not the ruling practice of it. I am speaking about the section 3, which contains 5 articles. 2 of them are interventions by Ramakant Agnihotri. One is the more general article, and the other is specifically a study of the new education policy by Kathleen Hu, Minati Panda, and Kumar Shahani. Hu and Panda and Agnihotri, there's a remarkable unity in this entire section on asking a very crucial question for somebody who is sitting in the global south, about when you have a highly multilingual society where you have constitutions and policies that pay a lot of lip service to multilingualism, how is education going so wrong, and what are the kinds of perspectives that from linguistics and from the study of language and education can bring in it. All of the articles are very, very thought-provoking, and I think that I will not do justice to focusing on just a few ideas in my presentation here, but I have only 15 minutes. Broadly, I think I would class all the articles as addressing, the need for a reconceptualization of the individual, the multilingual individual, and the education process, both as multilingual, and address some of the major challenges. And the challenges don't only come from policy, they come from our notions and practices of the social, where multiple languages, what kind of space do they occupy, if you want, cognitive and our social terrains, how they're reflected to pedagogy, how are they conceived of politically, and as well as in academics. Ramakant Agnihotri's first article Minati Panda's article, Kathleen Hughes' articles, all of them are at pains to locate the issue of multilingual education and how do we perceive multilinguality within the practice of linguistics, right? And to ask that if we were to change some of the crucial assumptions that are made in the academic literature, which then goes on to the applied linguistics literature, which goes on to language teacher training, that if we were to change those assumptions, would we be moving to a more inclusive, just and equal educational system and a society? The take that I'm going to present, and so it will involve a reading of the work that is presented in this very impressive section of 5 articles, is to ask, I'm a generative linguist, a Chomskyan linguist, as they would say, and some of the articles in this section raise this question: don't look at language only as a social aspect of a social object variable, but also to look at it from the perspective of the individual, the cognitive, and what linguists like Chomsky and other generativists had to say. And my take on it is going to be to look from generative grammar out, that is from the theory of the faculty of language and out. I'm not going to spend any time, of course, explaining the nitty-gritties of what Chomsky says. As a consequence, my presentation is going to be a little selective in what are the themes and issues in the papers that I will highlight, and essentially a little narcissistic or solipsistic in that I want to focus on the connections and the ideas that are represented in these papers to what I, as a generativist, think about language, society, and education. But I think that is perhaps the greatest homage one can pay to to peers and scholars' work, is if it does something for you. So I hope that it will not be seen as some sense of hubris that is asking me to contribute to it. There are a couple of things that I will not mention which actually do deserve a mention. In Kathleen Hughes' work, in linguistics, the idea of that, anything of the modern world and the can enter any thought stream of social science thinking or philosophy can enter in a globally referential way is extremely rare. And I found particularly the idea of that Kathleen Hughes raises about talking about a global South perspective on multilinguality, and how it conflicts. This is also then Minati Panda's work article here, that how it conflicts with the universalist position that from the global North, the perspectives of multilingualism, which is essentially additive, non-compound, and differentiated, and her reference. But unfortunately, I would strongly recommend these articles that I read. In fact, all of them are great. Okay. So as I said, my interest in this today is just to think about what do we mean when we say that people are multilingual, and that relates to the question of what is language. Now, it's a old, hoary chestnut, and I think completely superficial and superfluous debate between the nativist, mentalist approach of Noam Chomsky and the ones, and it is frequently opposed to the socially constituted linguistic communicative competence. Language is a social object. The fact of the matter is that what is called language is both biologically as well as socially constituted. in that, and this has to be theoretically, it's not an elsewhere description of language, that it's primarily biological and later socially constituted. And rather that the lens of somebody like Chomsky or the generative paradigm has been, and this can be critiqued, too firmly fixed on the biological aspect. But even in the theory that exists now in the nativist paradigm, language is both biological and social. So it has been, it's a pretty standard assumption in a generative framework is to say that nature's endowment gives us a language which is internal, individual, and intentional. And the object of study, inquiry, and understanding is what we call I languages. And so they are produced, if you want, almost inside FL by the mechanism. FL is Faculty of Language, and that has a grammar component in it, certainly, which is people call UG, but I will just stick with FL. And the aim of this exercise is to, of this conjecture, is to think of an individual acquiring language, an individual speaking language. So what, notions of the social are, of course, external to the individual. We are looking at a heritable, reproducible species, or species general, species, but species specific, species wide and species specific ability. And when an individual acquires it, so that the faculty of language that produces an I language or I languages is necessarily what that person acquires is an idiolect, right? And the conjecture is that the evolution of language and the primary focus of language is not communication, but an interface with thought. Language organizes thought, and what you have is a really individualized. Now, inside the faculty of language, so you don't have any notion of the speech community, the social out there is the usual interpretation that is given to such reading. Inside FL, there is in principle no limit to the number of I languages permitted by UG. So they have, inside FL, I languages have no names, so there's nothing called name Hindi or families. These names are just descriptive of a social reality. So either no family like I speak the language of my parents, or that I speak an Indo-Aryan family. There is no notion of the collective involved in the process of when it is like saying your lungs are born. When you're born, your lungs are really your own, and they're not, and they are produced by your genome, but they don't refer to a community of lungs. A language is just like this. But also inside the faculty of language, I languages do not express any form of social hierarchy at all. And it's in the externalization of language, in the social, outside the self, right, that language gains all these properties by faith. Okay. Now, an interesting puzzle here is that if all foreign, of all the faculty language of language yields are idiolects, then how do children end up speaking the same languages as the ones in their communities? Very influential work from the 80s, the father, mother, or whatever he would want to be, of population genetics, Cavalli-Sforza, Luca Cavalli-Sforza, suggests that the reason that why we end up speaking the same languages as the ones in your community is because of a parallel process, which he suggests is mimics, not mimics, is parallel really just to biological evolution, which what he calls cultural evolution or transmission. Right, so just like, so the reason why, so that the external environment induces a pressure by means of being the linguistic input to understanding to getting children to speak the same languages that resemble the languages of their home, and as many as languages as they are, if you get primarily linguistic data, you're going to learn them. And so so languages are then really created by both a necessary combination of the our social notion of languages, of the faculty of language, and the various steady states that that initial endowment attains, and what are the CT realities about language. So that's a set of attitudes and about identities, imagined communities, the notion of distinction from others. And it's because the CT is going giving you all these other notions about language. Those too come in the primary linguistic data and in the attitudes. The acquisition of language, if you want, is both a combination of FL and CT, but you can't have the acquisition of a stable form without the external world and the external world giving you the CT. So in the CT aspect, really, the language name that you have is a social fiction, which is often deployed in the interests of the consolidation of power in service of a systemic inequality. And I think that is the idea that underlies a lot of what Ramakant Agnihotri says when he defines multilinguality, that we're not, what the total endowment is considered with which children come to education, to the school or others, and all the other writers of the articles in the section also emphasize this, that there is that the system works as a composite. Then you have various steady states of individual languages, so that is, language distinctions are created by the faculty of language systems. They are necessary to maintaining stability of all these states. But the CT realities can also and do in multilingual the CT aspects of the object language are the ones that keep govern the, if you want, the coordination and the composite functioning of FL. Right? So there is no speech community. So if you use the word language when you say child comes to school with language, right? Yes, there has not necessarily one language. There are many states. So there can be individuals with only one steady state. So you can have monolingual individuals. The idea that that this too represents some kind of continuity with the past is actually false. In terms of the FL aspect, all the steady states that an individual has are of equal status, and the entire system can be used compositely. I don't have time, but these are the points. These are in these three articles are also implicitly in Kumar Shahani's article, or maybe I could not find a quote, was that in all of these, that what you have that comes to your school is not a mother tongue, but a rich, complex repertoire of linguistic choices with those, which might correspond to individual social fictions about speech communities or otherwise. And when they come to a school, that, as Hugh suggests, that the problem, what you have is an education system which is directed towards a monolingual system, a step where functional language is practiced as discretely separate monolingual systems. And the multilingual repertoires, as Panda says, are delegitimized for the majority of speakers. So, as a generative linguist and as somebody who believes in democracy and democratization, I think that the way that linguists, what these articles in these volumes ask us to do, is to recognize that, first of all, then linguistics, and particularly generative linguistics, are really all of linguistics must be Janus, and this is dwelt on. That is the god of Roman god of doorways, frames, transitions, and beginnings. And I'll leave you to conjecture as to who is the older god, the one that older face, the one who looks inwards into the cognitive capacity of individual of society, or the younger person or the older person is the one who looks into either inward into the mind or outward into the world.
Aisha, can we wrap up? I know there are 5 more pages of slides you have.
Yeah, no, I'm not going to do all of that, right?
Yeah, okay. So
I'm not going to do all of that. Right, so therefore, as linguists, what we need to do is to understand.
May I ask, what is CT? I forgot completely. I lost.
Yeah, so it's cultural transmission.
Okay.
So what the articles here do is say, they spend a lot of time on talking about how CT, the properties of CT of a language, are the properties that, which is then therefore shot through with power in exclusion, etc., are the ones that mask effectively the radical equality suggested by, given to you by the faculty of language. So to understand each stable state of a language is to identify in the study of language per se, right, is to understand what a possible human language can be in terms of our biology. For this, I would say that idealization is necessary, because this is so language is an object of rational inquiry. You need that abstraction to be able to comprehend the reality of the system. And for linguists, it is necessary, these articles argue, to understand how cultural transmission affects the nature of the input. So that is, besides attempting to conserve form, it is this cultural transmission which teaches hierarchies between languages, and that those are successively built up, right from within the family all the way to up. And I'm going to just leave you that with Cavalli-Sforza's 4 models of cultural transmission, and all of these are actually discussed in not these terms, in exactly the in the range of articles that we have here. So I'm going to stop here. We can come back to it maybe if you wanted the questions, or I can stop with that. But I would strongly recommend that all linguists in particular interested in education would read these articles in the volume from the perspective of the practice of linguistics in the decolonial mode, in the anti-colonial mode, rather where one asks whether how theories of the South, or at least of multilingualism, both as a component of formal linguistics, as well as a component of language and education, should be discovered. Thank you very much. It was a pleasure reading all these articles.
Thank you, Aisha. It's really dense, but I think I get a sense of what you're trying to get it. And it is, I think you speak, I completely agree with you that you speak about these works. Kumar Shahani's Apavramsha is an interesting piece of work, where Apavramsha is seen, the multivocality is central to the idea of. But I'm touched by the way you brought in such a dense thing into conversation with all the essays, which are written really, really lucidly and very, 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 very simply. But the density behind it has been brought out very well by Aisha. Thank you, Aisha. I would like Professor Amit Dhanda now to take us forward with her comments and reflections. Thank you. Unmute, Professor Dhanda.
Thank you so very much. And I also join in everyone to thank the editors for this wonderful book and for the invitation. And thank you, Professor Mohapatra, for giving me this opportunity. I think in your prefatory comments, you had spoken in terms of the interdisciplinarity of the book, not just in the fact of the editors coming from different disciplines, but contributions coming from all, I think. And similarly, I think they have worked at creating a panel which is also from different disciplines to be looking at the work. So I have been charged with looking at section 4, which is to examine the whole idea of social exclusion. And there are 5 papers there, 2 of them looking at disability closely, 1 looks at gender, 1 is looking at the whole issue of what neoliberalism is sort of starting to do in terms of exclusion. And the other is, the first paper is on about how do you teach inequality, or how do you address questions of equality in the classroom. So considering, I suppose, equality, inequality, in every time we talk about it, people do refer to the Constitution. We espouse the fact of that we have a Constitution which guarantees equality before the law and equal protection of the law. And it is kind of one of the reasons why which the Indian state very often tries to get all the brownie points by the fact that we have this fundamental rights chapter. So it's important, therefore, for, I think, all of us to keep asking that, are these fundamental rights really fundamental rights, a reality for the people of the country? Or when you talk in terms of all people, are you only limited to, or is there some kind of a, what's the difference, let's say, between what's on the paper and what functions on ground? And that's where I have been fascinated by these papers. And I've decided that I will sort of share with you what they meant to me as a law person, what kind of interdisciplinarity are they encouraging me to practice, or to at least look in a more critical way at what is very often produced by law people, though it's not like critical work doesn't come from law people, or we don't look at production from whether the court or from the legislature with unjaundiced eyes. We do sort of see that what they're doing and not doing. But I still think that amongst the things which is important, and that's how I see these papers, is to, what kind of learning they give us on the operation of this promise of the Constitution in the context of the real lives of people. So I am sort of seeing I'm beginning with Tanmay Bhattacharya's and Anita Ghai's, the 2 papers on disability, and to say that, okay, both of them in various ways are saying that the manner in which the whole okay, let me say one thing before I say this. See, in law too, we make this constant kind of distinction between formal and substantive equality. You speak about formal equality as where you say everybody is the same and everyone has been promised the same. But everybody is really not the same. And if everybody is really not the same, if you've been promised the same, is the result going to be equality or inequality? So I think one needs to begin from there and then proceed with seeing what context each one has tracked there. So Tanmay Bhattacharya, when he speaks in terms of are we all alike, he's saying that, when you speak about inclusion, largely you do this what we call as add and stir. You're just including, it's like various voices are coming in there, but the original system or the structure is not really being questioned. You're not changing what has already been said. You're saying, okay, this is a house we have created. Okay, we also give you entry. But your coming in is not going to mean any kind of restructuring of the house. It's not because you have come in, we must think about this place where we are staying in a different way. And that's where he says that when you talk in terms of difference, it should not be about a kind of a one-off thing that, that you keep at center whatever you see as the normal, the normate in the context of disability, what the way in which, say, the non-disabled operate, and you put up this comparison with disability, you say we'll give to people with disability what we have given to the non-disabled. But you don't say that what is to be guaranteed to all or what is basic is anyway going to be restructured or thought again because we've got another member in the family who may have a different perspective, that kind of thing. He's not using the analogy of the family, and I don't even know why I have used it, but anyway, that's the most critical point that he's making there. And he's saying that what you tend to do is, instead of in the process of inclusion, instead of seeing that, okay, with this person or this individual coming, what is this individual? See that individual or that person or that group for itself. Don't try to make it the special. Don't try to make it the exception. Don't work it in that manner. Whereas most of what has happened in terms of affirmative action for people with disabilities has operated on this logic of that, okay, how are we going to give you the same as what we give to everyone else, but what the same you've given to everyone else may not be what I want or need or require or can contribute on. And I think that's, for me, the most significant point that Tanmoy is making in his paper, where he's saying that, all right, if you are acknowledging difference, then acknowledge difference to make for a richer diversity. Don't acknowledge difference where you still, without really speaking about the normate as, the normate is not what is visibilized. You're not really speaking about what do you consider normal. What you are speaking about is all your attention is on the deviance, on the person with disability, on saying how you are different and what we need to do to accommodate you. But at no point at all do you think there is a need to rethink the norm. So I think that's his most important thing. And I somewhere feel the manner in which we do classification law, the way we sort of categorize people into groups, the general thrust is that you give the same. I remember I was involved in the whole drafting process for the Convention on the Rights of People with Disabilities. And one of the themes which constantly came in, maybe as political strategy, but it was that we are not giving to people with disabilities anything more. We're giving them just exactly what has been given to everyone else. Not recognizing that if you are really wanting equality and not wanting to perpetuate inequality, you need somewhere to reconceive. Anita Ghai takes this same point further, where she is kind of bemoaning this, that the manner in which she's looked at the education policies, the various kind of interventions which have come in both law and policy, and saying that somehow the other, you've continued with this binary of the regular and the special. You've all of the time, the manner in which you've organized educational services, or the way in which you've perpetuated discrimination because you've stayed with two systems. And at each point, the two phrases that she has a lot of problem with, and it's perfectly, like, one can understand the almost the anger and the agony with which she's saying is that you are all the time saying you'll give to people with disabilities whatever is feasible, as far as possible. So, like the point which Tanmay was making, Anita is making again, where she's saying that, okay, what you're just trying to do there is, you are saying we'll make you as close to. So the norm doesn't in any which way change. So the very fact that you are doing this as far as feasible, or as whatever is feasible, or as far as possible, what you are landing up doing there somewhere is that you are devaluing the person with disability, and that in itself becomes a big problem. The entire construction is exclusionary. You're so focused on special results and in the way in which the your planning is happening, that you are not really concerned with how you're going to work. What is the contribution the person with disability is going to make? And the very fact that you're not thinking in this manner, the contribution which can come from the perspective of disability is what you are not worrying on. I mean, with disability rights and disability studies, you're talking in terms of knowledge production in a different way, your contribution from people with disabilities. But the way in which our education law and policy has been formulated, that's something that we've not given scope for. We've not really allowed it to happen. And so that's why she's kind of titled her paper, Have We Really Moved Forward? Or are we still sort of carrying on in this manner of where, we're going to keep this twin track going, and we're going to give you as much as you can possibly get, or as far as possible, we're going to treat you as others. And that's the treat you as what we see as the norm. Manjushri Singh, who's the person who's written on women's education, which is the third paper I'm looking at, she's recounted again, she's looked at, in fact, all of the papers have spent a lot of time in looking at what has come in various policy documents, what has come in relevant laws, what kind of commissions, and also looking at facts and figures to say, okay, if this is what had happened, what was the gain which came? So which is the same thing that Manjushri Singh has done. And she's kind of seen that how women's education has taken this upward climb. The critical point, which is the central argument of her paper, is saying that yes, that you have opened up opportunity for women, but in opening up that opportunity, you've not really looked at the power dynamics which functions in the family. So in effect, we talk in terms of the personal is political, we talk in terms of the public-private divide is problematic. And yet, when you are asking for how you should be ensuring that equality of opportunity in fact happens, can you really be only talking about what is happening in public policy without seeing how the power dynamics functions in the family? So her point is, I think the core point that she's making there is that if you're not looking at what is happening in the family, and you're not looking at that how the way in which gender operates in the dynamics of the family, even if the woman gets educated, she's still like looking for approval. She's looking for some kind of a endorsement from within the family to be able to use that education to its utmost. So you find them making compromises in terms of careers, unless and until you've got yourself some kind of I would say, both intellectual and other equipment. All of us have been I think at this point, really been full of, Kamala Basin's going and Sonal Shukla's going has kind of, a lot of very, very major women's movements leaders going. And the stories which have coming out from there are the stories of when they got this support, this strong emotional support from outside of the family, that women were able to kind of make that kind of assertion. So what Manjushri Singh is saying is this, that unless and until your education policy and law and the various opportunities that are happening don't take into account what is happening outside of just your, the policy or the opportunities they're giving there, you're not really going to be able to achieve that. She has a sentence somewhere in the end where she speaks in terms of that the state has not really looked at the social norms and practices that influence academic decisions. I would only have my response somewhere would be that it is much better that the state should not be looking at it. But we need to be looking at other kind of interventions which have happened. And if those interventions need space or need some sort of support, what should that support be? But to speak about the state not having worried about how the family's suzerainty or how a particular family looks at the whole issue of women's empowerment and education, I don't think that's a matter for state policy, but I definitely do think that we need to acknowledge that if this equality is to have is to be meaningful for the individual women, then what is it that you're going to do out there? These three papers have looked at, I suppose, two excluded populations, when Anand Teltumbe is looked at, where he's speaking in terms of the impact of neoliberalism on education, he's beginning from looking at the manner in which Manu had ousted, Manu Smriti had ousted a whole body of people out of the realm of education, to say, okay, you are not to study, and exactly what that meant for like how much of the exclusion that has been suffered by the entire Dalit community, how much of that is coming in from this embargo to education, that you will not. And then he's kind of proceeded from there to demonstrate that, okay, when you brought in affirmative action policies, with all their limitations, you still found that, suddenly the people who were breaking through were people who were coming in from what you call as your SCST or whatever, the impact that was happening there. And he's kind of actually given figures to say that the benefit which was taken of that public education came from people who had been kept out of education for a long period of time. And I suppose he set up in his starting with Manu, looking at the entire development of education rights before. I don't know where I'm on time, but I have just 2 more points to make. So if I have not seen the time, so you can tell me.
That's
how much.
Okay. It's okay.
Yeah.
Just to finish that in 2 minutes.
No. I am sort of, I'm on the 4th paper and I have just 1 more left. And because I really do think that in terms of imagination, what Anand Teltumbe has done is that he's set up this big comparison between law and policy. And he's saying that, all right, whilst when you granted that affirmative action and you granted those rights within the Constitution as well as otherwise, you suddenly had a very disadvantaged group of people being able to come forward and sort of claim what was their own. With neoliberalism, what has happened somewhere is this: when you're privatizing of education in the way in which you are, the way in which you're putting the whole business of what kind of resources you require to be able to access education, the entire ouster of, the state stepping back and you saying, all right, education is now in the private sphere, which necessarily meant that you need to have that kind of a deep pocket to be able to access that education. So the people who, and then this distinction that we are making between primary education and higher education, because it's higher education which is going to be that merit good, which is required for people who have to dislodge the kind of discrimination that they have been, suffering from centuries. So the moment you bring in all this kind of justifications which are being put out in neoliberal policy, who's going to be the biggest loser of it all is the people who had been ousted by Manu are being ousted all over again by the neoliberal policy. That's a core point that he's making there. And he's also somewhere saying is that unlike Manu Smriti, which maybe was followed or not followed, which at least you could still be, talking about it as, an outdated kind of a way of looking at the perpetuation of caste, which was done in, you are justifying the neoliberal policy on grounds of rationality and reason. It is much, much more difficult to dislodge. You're getting the state itself to become, some kind of a minion to what is being dictated elsewhere. And who's going to be the loser of it all is going to be the very people who you have discriminated over so many periods of time. So all this business of everybody votes for the affirmative action policy, and yet you have, in a way, you can sort of say, taken the kernel away from it all. And that's problematic. My last point is the paper which comes in from
Subramanian.
Yeah, where he sort of, see what is fascinating about that paper, I think unlike the others, we all of the times when we talk in terms of the importance of education, we talk also about that education is something we need because that's the way in which we teach. We're going to be changing attitudes. And if you don't change attitudes, you can bring the most, bombastic of laws and whatever, all the symbolism can happen. But what is going to work on the ground will be altering and changing. So for him, it becomes, he's talking about teaching about inequality. And I've, as a teacher, found it extremely interesting that he's focused on the fact of that how is it that you keep perpetuating the status quo? How is it that though people are getting educated, you don't teach them to critique? What is the manner in which maybe you create your textbooks, the manner in which you teach in your classroom? How you find it easier to go with, very simplistic kind of definitions, or very plauditory kind of, like he's got the Phule example, and he say you'll have any number of sentences being written about how wonderful they were and what all they did, but you don't really talk about like what did they have to face to do this, how did they do what they did. So those details don't come. You do the praise, you do the other kind of applause, but you don't really teach or discuss the processes by which things have happened. You go with, like banal sort of definitions, but you don't unpack those and say, okay, what does this mean? If this kind of thing is being practiced, what does it mean? And I felt that, like even if you're taking a very conservative approach, he says, the moment you start going into details, the moment you start, instead of glorifying and applauding, you start to go for critical inquiry, you start to challenge status quo. And if you don't teach people how to critically see what is around them, education cannot be the pathway to equality. For people to get education be that pathway, you need to understand inequality. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Professor Handa. Thank you. That's really comprehensive, and I think focuses our mind again back to I think now I'll ask Professor Narasimha Reddy to do the last rites of the book. Book's life is going to, so it'll be nice to see your comments, which are.
Thank you, Prabhu, and thanks to the organizers for giving me an opportunity to be part of this event of release of these substantive contributions to the understanding of education in all its historical dimensions up to that of the present state. In fact, the challenge is that each contribution is so meticulous and detailedly documented. It would be very difficult to comment, even though if you're asked to comment on 4 or 5 papers in 15 minutes, but let's try. In fact, I say this because though it's divided into 5 parts, each part could be a standalone book by itself. In fact, there is no exaggeration if I say there are some contributions of individual papers which could stand alone as a monograph of substantive interest. But of course, the greatness, as you mentioned in the beginning, is that all they gel together thematically from one to that of the other. And the last part is mine. It is supposed to be the impact of neoliberalism on educational inequality. In fact, there are about 5 papers. There are 5 papers in this part. I may be a little bit biased in favor of all the papers, and therefore I may not have much of critical kind of comments, but of course I hopefully try to present them as sincerely as possible in trying to carry their messages. I say this because this is a part which I think as we go along deals with that of neoliberalism, which has affected all dimensions of our existence today. I mean, education is one, and of course, if you move on, health, employment, earnings, and in fact, the entire source of what we call as inequality could be seen in terms of the shift to that of this policy regime. And therefore, I think I would begin with that of, let's say, not in the order that they're presented here, but of course, I will begin with that of Anil Satgopal's, a fairly substantive, as I was trying to say, almost a monographical kind of contribution, and then go on to that of Professor Haragopal's paper, and then, of course, Padma Milaskar, followed by Poonam Batra, and briefly, towards the end, make a remark or two on the rich contribution by Rich Gibson. It's a challenge for me to talk about that paper, and therefore I may not do much justice to that, because of course the context is different, and the kind of things said perhaps are the ones which may completely digress the kind of attention that I would like those who are listening to this book to have. The paper by Professor Anil Sadgopal is on post-independence political economy of education, from welfarism to that of, let's say, neoliberalism in alliance with fascism. The title, I think, conveys such strongly as to what has been happening. In fact, some of the things in this lengthy contribution may sound familiar. What perhaps is familiar is, we know this, what happened to that of education in this period, which perhaps is referring to the post-independence period. We may to an extent also know how it happened, but this political economy dimension brings in why and in what way it has happened, at whose instance it has happened. This is where he brings in at the behest of which class it has been happening. And then, of course, with what consequences to the process of social transformation, equality, and democratic polity. And this, I think, is, in that sense, a reflection of as to what is happening. He discusses the post-independence situation in three phases. The first, of course, is the phase 47 to that of 1968. Then, of course, 68, 91. And then the present phase, which perhaps almost is routinely referred to as the one beginning with that of 1991. When it comes to the first phase, I think it's soon after independence and even before the republic gets, let's say, declared. It was the first commission that he refers to, Radhakrishna Commission of 1948, which was a very high view of education, and therefore it also looks at substantially higher education and then promotion of science and technology, which I think Anil calls it as some kind of a top-down approach to that of higher education, building of institution of excellence for higher education. In the process, what exactly was happening was the neglect of attention as much as should have got the school education. And in fact, of course, there was some kind of a passing commission of Mudaliar Committee on secondary education, but that didn't bring much. And the more substantive aspect, which perhaps we keep on citing as a reference point, is that of the commission, which we refer to Education Commission of 64, 66, Kothari Commission. And one of the perhaps things that could be considered as perhaps more, that's I think gets repeated in the other papers that we go on. This is the commission that perhaps which made that radical recommendation relating to that of common school system. And in fact, the emphasis with which it was an emphatic assertion that education based on capacity to pay has no valid place in the new democratic and socialistic society we desire to create. I mean, this becomes a reference point to that of even today as to how far we have gone away from this. In fact, in this particular section, there are three papers which draw our attention. Two substantially discuss, let's say, how there has been a systematic destruction of, let's say, the approach that is common school, where we have made progress in a comeback. And when it comes to the question of the second phase, that is, of course, 68 to that of 91, there are interesting contradictory kind of things that happen here. In fact, if you begin with that, he very positively notes what happened in 70s. The 70s is seen as a substantial, never before. If you take the entire period up to that of 2001, 70s was a decade where was rapid growth of both educational institutions, schools and then enrollments in schools. The rate of growth of the expansion of schools, expansion of teachers was highest compared to any other decade up down to that of, let's say, 2000s. And this is a positive kind of thing, but on that comes in other kind of dimensions. For instance, it's also the period when it comes to the question of intervention to push education into that of high command kind of a thing. That's a tendency towards that of centralization of education comes in through that of 1976 amendment of the Constitution and shifting education to that of concurrent list. And then, of course, comes in the National Policy on Education 86, which lays foundation for all that we talk in terms of, in fact, one would stretch the neoliberalism already taking birth by 1980s. Therefore, if you stretch that period, it's also, this is the National Policy of Education, which perhaps in 1986 brought in certain kinds of things, I think, which could be summed up as he does into that of, let's say, diluting the entire education infrastructure, teacher-related kind of, let's say, training, and let's say, underfunding of education begins with that. And then the worst thing is that it's the beginning of building of multi-layered institutions. Unabashedly, commercialization of education begins. And then, of course, this is already, this is exactly where I think the link between of education, we were told as children, we were told in the school, everywhere, education is supposed to be an instrument to break the kind of, let's say, stratification that exists. That's the only lever that perhaps elevates into that of more democratic process. Exact opposite happens. In an already highly stratified kind of a society, the kind of changes that are visualized through this multilayerism, privatization, and commercialization, the stratification gets some kind of a rebirth into that of education. What little perhaps was done for 20 years gets, in fact, everybody would say that education, at least up to 80s, was seen as largely driven by public school education, or let's say, if not entirely common school education. But the contradiction here is interesting, that every measure that is taken has two dimensions. But for instance, you introduce autonomous college, parallelly you introduce, let's say, self-financing kind of a system. And this perhaps they introduce what is called as a non-formal education system. And along with that, you also introduce high quality Navodaya schools. I mean, that's even now that survives with 80 students per district being taken every year. This kind of that itself is interesting kind of where millions of students are taken into something else. And this happens. The third phase is, of course, 1991. As it happens, he begins with that of the structural adjustment and that of elementary education, because the structural adjustment program is the heart and soul of what we call as neoliberalism. If neoliberalism has a heart and also a soul, this is a ruthless kind of a process that has been unleashed. And therefore, he tries to demonstrate what this neoliberalism, particularly driven by the multilateral institutions like World Bank, and then he refers to that of 1990 Geometrian Declaration. Interestingly, he makes a systematic comparison of what Geometrian Declaration of 1990 under the behest of World Bank was, and what perhaps it was under the Indian Constitution when it comes to the question of education. In fact, he says this particular declaration of the World Bank-led conference has led to that of systematically dilute, distort, and demolish India's vast school education system by openly advocating privatization, commercialization, even going to the extent of, let's say, the informal schools, private schools, NGO-run schools, all kinds of things. And he sums up, this is happening in fivefold manner. First, of course, is the state abdicates constitutional obligation to educate even school at the school level. The spirit of this declaration had neither human rights spirit nor any respect for fundamental rights that we have written into our constitution. Education is seen as not building conscious citizenship. And this is where we find the dichotomy between education transforming from that of one which is an intrinsic as much as instrumental values. The emphasis now shifts entirely to that of education as an instrument to train people who can serve as workforce with skills and some kind of capabilities, rather than its intrinsic kind of qualities, which is supposed to be to meet the civilized requirements of a future democratic system. I mean that the school system gets into that of multilateralism already said, and then education gets reduced as any kind of commodity, a tradable commodity at that. And then he moves on to that of the analysis in terms of examples of two states. He brings in Tamil Nadu. What happened to that of school education in Tamil Nadu, and then, of course, Madhya Pradesh. In Tamil Nadu, he talks in terms of the strong kind of a common school system because of the Tamil Nadu's historical social movements, which included people like that of, let's say, Singaravelu, Ayuthi Das, and also Periyar, of course, substantially. And it's a significant kind of movement. It doesn't not only talk about common school, talks in terms of gender, talks in terms of the so-called marginalized communities. And therefore, with that spirit, even the then existing 1954 comrades kind of a government, Congress government, pushes for adequate extension of common school type, but it reaches a peak. I mean, substantial achievement of common school in Tamil Nadu moves on to that of 80s, but I think the last 2 decades it faces a reversal. And then, of course, it turns to Madhya Pradesh example, which is, of course.
Professor Reddy, sorry, can we, because we'll have maybe 3-4 minutes. I know it's, sorry.
No, I have another 4 minutes, 5 minutes.
Yeah, 4 minutes, yeah.
4 minutes, let's say 4 points. I know that.
Sorry, there's just 10 minutes left for response and some questions from.
Okay, then I would be, because no, I am totally for these contributions. All that I would say that the Hoshangabad experiment he makes, he refers to how it has extended the science teaching program to that of as many as 750 schools in 3 states. But I think then comes suddenly in 2002, a late reaction, late product of, let's say, neoliberalism, that there is a fatwa that all these schools must be closed. They must come back to that of traditional system. Similarly, I think the Hargopal's paper talks in terms of his focus is on common school, looks at 3 countries, United States and China. United States is prized for its school system even now, but I think with all its defects and the kind of pressures for so-called closure of schools, integration of schools, still substantially it exists as a dominant part is that of, let's say, common school. In China also, he documents at some point there was a reversal to the common school system, but I think there was a even in China, there is resistance, and therefore they have reversed. And therefore, the role played by the non-public school in China is marginal even now. But of course, India's story is well known. And in fact, he the main agenda for the All India Forum for Right to Education is essentially to bring back common school. That's how it ends. I think Padma Velaskar sees an excellent detailed kind of a documentation of what happened in Bombay, which was perhaps the earliest one to go on the path of, let's say, common school. And she talks in terms of Bombay Municipal Corporation as pioneer. In 1919, they brought in education as a public good and the provision of public provision of education to every child. 1923, Bombay Corporation recognized by law the obligation of the corporation to provide education. The education institutions were largely dominated by the local governments, panchayats down. 1960, Maharashtra state renewed effort to take total kind of a shift here. This is where I think 86 policy comes in, and the government of Maharashtra, Bombay municipality also fall in line. A systematic kind of restructuring in favor, which she just sums up in terms of what could be called as okay, I'll just close by referring to that of what she calls it as, let's say, cumulative result is that Bombay Municipal Corporation ends up as an institution unfit to deliver right to free and compulsory education. That's the situation. And this is, I think, a little more further focusing on the nature of things that are happening under neoliberalism to education. The paper by Batra comes to, Poonam Batra comes to just focus. I mean, of course, it's a rich background for this paper, and therefore there is no time for me. But I will just go as to what she sees that this neoliberalism has done. I mean, in fact, in one sentence, you could say, observe as to what she sums up governance as a means to, because the instrument for destroying school system becomes the education, the so-called new education policy itself, and then instrument to enhance inequality itself. Quickly, what she says is, she shows this in 6 dimensions, legitimizing and regularizing all shades of private schools, shift from public provision to that of quality education to that of instead of public provision, you shift to that of a public regulator of private schools, if at all that there is a regulation at all. Process of underinvestment in public institution, a well-known phenomenon of neoliberalism. Disengaging the teacher education. This is, I think, there's a lot of focus in the paper. Not much justice would be done if I just say that, but one would read it. That, for instance, one of the key things is that of teachers' education, which has continued to be neglected and substantive. The so-called NEP 2020 doesn't even refer to that, of the way in which you perhaps train your teachers, subjecting entire teacher education system as some kind of a thing that could be done outside perhaps the public system. Shift in governance from the state level increasingly to that of bureaucratic center, and then of course the political executive at the top. And then of course I just would like to close it by observing that there could be several things said, but these are a set of papers. Particularly, I would refer to that of the section 5. They are not papers written to satisfy intellectual curiosity, which leads you to do something which could be substantial contribution to understanding a phenomenon. But they are essentially written by, as perhaps was introduced by Prabhu, a scholar activist with a commitment. The basic purpose, at least, of these papers is to get perhaps some kind of a disastrous damage that's being done by the present neoliberalism and the product of that neoliberalism, which has come into that of NEP 2020. I mean, I close this because I will be doing at least lip sympathy to that of Rich Gibson's paper. He has a paper which perhaps is very difficult to handle for me. Why it is possible and imperative to teach capital, empire, and revolution, and how. He says that we are talking in terms of resistance and change here, but he says resistance merely recreates ignorance and despair, like that of dark ages of barbarians. And therefore his emphasis is on the absence of revolutionary movement for equality. Education remains snared by capital and empire. I mean, this is a message, and I feel very bad for not summing him up. But I think as perhaps it happened, I only wish that, that I must also say this, everybody complimented the editors and the patience they would have had in putting this together so meticulously. I have not seen any mistakes either. 750 pages. Each paper is a very challenging kind of a paper. Extensive notes and references. Often mistakes are made. I congratulate them for bringing this. And of course, the publishers who have been very conscious. They have reminded you so many times. And they know the value of their product. And therefore, unlike neoliberalism, they know the public value of this volume. And I also congratulate them. Thank you very much. Sorry.
Thank you, Professor Reddy. I know there's very little time left, and we need to open it up for at least some reflection on it. I just want to say that to tell that what Professor Reddy concluded with, that this is not if you feel this is some kind of academic book which is bloodless, it is not. It is a really deeply disturbing book. If you are not disturbed by reading this book, I think you need to get yourself checked. I just want to point out one thing, and that one of the things is about the pictures in this. There are very few. I just want to point two of them to say how frightful this effect the book is. This is in 244, page 244, a page showing Mekala Polygadu, who's in the reformatory school. I wish you can see the face of this little boy, 14-year-old boy, who's been taken through this policeman. The sheer violence and the sheer fear, and if you can see in the eyes of this boy, I think that's the destruction that we. And the second one is much more violent. This is from Tanmay Bhattacharya's brilliant article, which is about the norm, the norma, which is the carpenter's square. It is, if you look at it and the way he develops it, this is a frightful instrument. It's a terrorizing instrument. It's an instrument of the norma, the norm. And he shows brilliantly how this norm quickly translates into state power. The norm is then enforced through state power. I just wanted to point this out to tell the underlying thread of this book is basically, if I may say, there is basically between a colonial period with its colonial violence presupposed and the neoliberal violence presupposed in the present. The in-between period, so-called Nehruvian period, is actually a gap in the book. But that's there to highlight the difference or the similarities between the colonial educational systems and colonial levels of inequality, the violence of colonialism, in order to show the congruence of colonial violence with the contemporary violence, destruction, the words which have become sharper and sharper as we go through the book, including Rich Gibson's final article. It becomes sharper and sharper. It's about destruction. We are in some, and I might sound apocalyptic. One of the gaps of the book is not to bring in, it can't talk about everything. The book has talked about everything, but it hasn't brought in the massive destruction of climate that has happened and that we are undergoing. We're living through this period of violence in some sense. So I'm telling you, I don't recommend it as a gentleman's book, not written by gentlemen, and it is actually about it's a bloody book. It's a book about the bloody revolution, counter-revolution brought about both by colonialism and by neoliberalism in some sense. Thank you. I don't want to comment, and I will ask Aditi to pick up some of the questions to the panelists if they are there. Yeah.
Yes, so we will now take up questions from the audience that have been flowing in during the conversation. The first question is by Deepika Handa. She asks, my question is related to the modern education system. My central concern is to understand how modern education plays a role in migration. How modern education plays an important role, destroy rural livelihood, indigenous knowledge system.
Do you want this answer, or do you want to get the second question or third question? So I can ask.
No, I think we'd like to start with this first.
I think anyone can choose to answer this, but I suppose Professor Reddy, or because you are a political economist, it is just quickly if you can answer this. That's it's about migration and what destruction of indigenous systems or whatever livelihood structures.
I think, although it apparently appears to be, I think both are two extreme kind of situations. The migration of the kind, perhaps what you have in mind about migration makes a lot of difference. Education can contribute to that of healthy migration. Or for instance, most of us who are here around are migrants. What contributed to our migration is essentially education. So take that apart, lack of education and then lack of matching kind. That's what we are trying to look at. Let's say the destruction is making education which is not accessible to that of people perhaps who need some kind of a not only looking at their capability of doing something, but also participating in a democratic process to raise a voice when you are treated like what you have been treated during the COVID period. In fact, that is partly you can see that, first of all, you denied them education, you denied them right education, and therefore you have treated them as, let's say, subhuman beings. That's what we are talking in terms of give them proper education, give them education as a right. They will assert their rights and perhaps the transformation. You can't have insecure, unstable kind of migration. The other side is that there is a great deal of debate about, let's say, the local or let's say indigenous knowledge. I think that comes from the colonialism where I think you thought only that which comes from modern. This is, I think, all the people here are much better experts on modern education and then what kind of things it has done. But one thing that it has done is that it has made us subservient to that of things which we actually possessed as a capacities to see as, let's say, incapacities. So, in fact, the confidence killing kind of a thing also happened in education.
Yes.
And therefore, you also have a nation without a confidence in challenging kind of roles. And then perhaps we wouldn't have ended up in this kind of a situation if we had that. That's what my understanding is.
Is anyone want to speak? Deepak or Aisha or Professor Handa, do you want to respond to this quickly? I would say just if you have any thoughts about it, or otherwise we'll take the next question. Aisha, you want to say something? You look like you're being thoughtful. Unmute, Aisha.
Well, just to make the point about language and the discontinuities that knowledge systems have been produced. And there might be knowledge systems just about language. And the fact that we've had the world over, but certainly much more in India, where there actually linguistic systems were well developed. I just wanted to flag, for example, one instance where Gondi had a script. So there's a very big language spoken in central and western parts of India. It had a script, and there are two documents, two fairly large repositories. And colonialism, the script died and was lost and was recovered only about 20 years ago, rediscovered only 20 years ago. And there were documents in that script. This is true for, there are many local scripts, because the idea, the letterless native, and then that script has been revived, and what you have is now textbooks translated, and that has directly correlated with a measure in the improvement of both these speakers in school performance. So it's not whether, there was basically knowledge migrated out of communities which in their local domains, and it was not necessarily what the world discourse on language endangerment tends to say is that it is about, jari booty and, medicinal plants. So that's how you sell it. It's knowledge about language, about literature. So, the fact of the matter is that for a language as big as Hindi and as big as Sanskrit, you don't have any systematic archives of these languages, of the magazines. Nothing has been created. Right? So in that sense, the skilling aspect of education, right, which is what has been prioritized. The languages that have been planned are the languages that are most recently born in India, Hindi and English, right, as languages of education. Those continue to be planned. And they are, a language that nobody really, sure, it's spoken, but it's it's a minority language, one minority language, Sanskrit. And every policy after policy, we plan, and more, I think, that alienation from knowledge itself, where it seems like folk knowledge, but actually it is systematized knowledge, is something that our system reproduces.
Thank you. That's about. Any other questions you had?
Yes, I think Professor Amita Dhanda would want to answer this question. It's a question from Santosh Kumar. Are Tanmay's and Ghai's papers critiques of reasonable accommodation? I think Professor Dhanda volunteered to answer this question.
Well, I would not say that it's a critique of reasonable accommodation. I think it's a critique of asking for reasonableness to be dropped there. What you are primarily saying is that when you speak about reasonable accommodation, you are somewhere saying, the point which Anita is especially saying very strongly, that you're saying as far as possible. They're both pleading for the fact is that your construction of reasonable accommodation has to be one of inclusion. And inclusion means that just no one should be left behind. Reasonable, the moment you say reasonable, it means that some can come in and some can be left out. And they are saying that no, every individual person should be coming in. So the concept of reasonable accommodation, to the extent that it's furthering inclusion, yes, but I think it's more dropping of the whole notion of reasonable, which says proportionality as far as possible. That's what they are asking to change.
Perhaps also of dropping accommodation, the idea that there is
in a way.
Re-envisionment, actually.
It's like, I have this thing is that if there's another way of seeing it is that if anybody is left behind, it's not reasonable and it's not accommodation. So because if you bring in the notion of proportionality and you say as far as possible, we will do it. That's what they are critiquing much more than the fact of that, because they're pleading for inclusion and they're saying every single person should come in. That's how I see at least, especially Tanmoy, the way he's ended, he's saying, okay, the moment you see somebody different, you don't start saying that, okay, this is different and excluding and all that. You should start saying, this is a person who needs to be there for himself or herself, or, like the whole range, that you have just to talk about people to come in as themselves. I think themselves is the appropriate terminology to use.
Right. Thank you, ma'am, for that comprehensive answer. We'll now take the final question for the session. This is by Siva Prasad Ram Bhatla. He says, very good panel discussion. Given the NEP 2020, how can we visualize the complexities and the divisions it furthers? I think that's a very...
Yes.
Professor Mahapatra, would you...
No. Because I would like to also, in a way, NEP 2020, I see this book had almost anticipated everything. It's an incredible book. It was on a conference in 2014. It had almost also anticipated partly what the concentration and aggravation of NEP 2020 will happen. But I think there is one missing point. The missing point is accepting Lakshmi Subramaniam's very small thing about e-guru, the massive proliferation of educational technology, edutech, the technologization of education, so that you can now have virtual education, you have edutech companies which have billions of dollars, Baiju or whatever this now are like called unicorns. These new forms of, I don't think anyone anticipated this particular formation or this way it will go, and it is going to take over so much of the NEET exams, the online exams, all through this is, I don't want to say that it is going to take over everything. It cannot, because as we say, technology has this problem, the technological inequalities which have been highlighted would be, everyone, even in this, I don't know how many people could have really listened to our talk without bursting their bandwidth and so on and so forth. But I think the NEP kind of the technologization, the techno-fixing of the problems which are known for some time. The techno-fixing is a new novel challenge of my sense would be. I don't know what would you say. This is something which actually hasn't been taken up. I don't blame the book, because book can't do everything, but it did an amazing amount of things. It laid out the ground so that you can benchmark the past, or benchmark it so that you can measure it from the past, and also look out to the future in some sense. It opens up to the future, the book in its layout. And I think that's important. It can't, of course, NEP 2000, there are two very substantial articles in this book, but not everything could have been foreseen. That is my...
Okay. Right. So that was the last question for today, which brings us to the end of our event. I'd like to thank our panelists for their time and for a very interesting and engaging discussion. I'd also like to thank all members of the audience who've tuned in today through Zoom and YouTube. We sincerely hope you enjoyed this discussion. Good night and stay safe.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you, Prabhu. Nice seeing you.
And nice seeing you. No mistakes, Aditi. No mistakes.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Hey, yeah. Okay, bye-bye. Bye, Aisha.
Bye-bye.
Bye, Dennis. Dennis, good to see you. Very good to see you. Very good to see Aisha.
See you.
We should connect.
Yeah, we are on an active WhatsApp group together. Email group. I'm on that group too. So.
Okay. Okay, Vikas. Happy birthday again. Happy birthday, Vikas. I think it's done a great job. And Ramakantji, I can't tell you, Ramakantji is not going to show his face. He said actually we should stay back. What is it? What? Beethoven. Oh. Okay.
Okay, we can leave right.
Yeah. Bye bye. Bye bye.
Bye 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 bye.